grateful to Rab Koneski for inviting me to speak to you all this evening. It's a pleasure. It's a particular pleasure because I'm now very unaccustomed to actually talking in person. I'm so used to giving Zoom talks that it's actually a very strange experience to see actual human beings in front of me. I've been teaching at UCLA for 2.5 years. Most of those courses have been taught online. I don't even see my students. It's only over the last couple of months actually that I've actually been teaching again in person, but even then, you know, I just see a sea of faces with masks on. So it's even not wearing a mask now is a very new experience, exhilarating one. So it's a real special pleasure for me to be here and being able to actually talk to you in person and you on the screen as well. I can't promise to be able to solve some of these issues that we're all wrestling with. I think in all honesty, you know, I'm wrestling with the same issues. I have to wrestle with them both as a Jew, a Zionist, and as a professor who teaches on these topics. So I'm often kind of wrestling with my own angst, questions, but I hope at least, you know, we can have a conversation about this and maybe I can offer some modest suggestions, I think. What I will do, being an academic, is first of all provide some historical context for where we are and how things have come to be. And I think it's important. So I'm going to talk about the challenges facing Zionism, specifically in the United States, and the challenges facing American Jewish Zionists in particular. I'm not going to be talking very much about Christian Zionists in the United States, but it's important to bear in mind that that is by far the largest community of Zionists in the United States. But before I talk about the challenges, I think it's first of all important to recognize the success. And I'm not talking about the success of Zionism in the land of Israel, in Israel itself, familiar with that, which is probably one of the most, if not the most successful national liberation movements in the course of the 20th century against really great odds. And I think it's always important to have that recognition in mind, something we easily can take for granted today, but also to recognize the astonishing success really of Zionism in the United States over the course of the 20th century, and particularly in the second half of the 20th century. I think it's fair to say that over the course of the second half of the 20th century, Zionism really won the hearts and minds of Americans, not just Jewish Americans, but Americans in general, in a very remarkable way, because if we kind of think back to the period of time before Israel was established, from the late 19th century through the early half of the 20th century, Zionism was not a majority movement among either Americans or American Jews. Most American Jews were lukewarm at best about Zionism. And major American Jewish organizations like the AJC, the American Jewish Committee, were anti-Zionist, opposing Zionism, as did many Reform congregations, on the ground for different reasons, but I think generally a sense that Zionism, in the eyes of many American Jews, was perceived as a threat to their own integration or assimilation into the United States. It at best was seen as a solution to someone else's problem, specifically to the challenges and the threats facing Jews in Europe. It wasn't seen as something that was really of relevance or need for American Jews themselves. So it wasn't really until the Holocaust that American Jewry shifted in a decisive way in support of Jewish statehood, really changing their attitudes towards Israel and, or I should say towards the Zionist project in Palestine at the time. But American Jews played a really crucial and I think sometimes under-recognized role in Israel's establishment in terms of actually helping Israel survive and gaining the US government support. Nevertheless, after having played this really pivotal role in getting the United States government to support partition and then to ensure that the new state of Israel survived its first battles, in the period following Israel's establishment, it wasn't of major interest to most American Jews. I mean, significantly, although they came to support Zionism, most American Jews didn't decide to move to Israel. The Zionism for American Jews, unlike Zionism, you may have probably picked up a slight accent in my. So for many Jews in the diaspora, Zionism, being a Zionist, meant Aliyah, meant moving to Israel, or at least seriously wrestling with the question of whether to live in Israel. And that hasn't been the case. I mean, American Zionism, American Jewish Zionism is quite distinctive in that respect, that it doesn't really entail actually living in Israel and making Aliyah. It's rather involved supporting the Zionist projects and supporting the state of Israel from afar, mostly through philanthropy. The ubiquitous blue box, the JNF blue box, and buying Israel bonds and other ways of supporting Israel philanthropically, but not through the kind of practical act of actually going and moving to Israel itself. Where I think the relationship really shifts, and I'm sure this kind of narrative is familiar to you all, is after 1967, after the Six-Day War of 1967. That's what really transformed American Jewish attitudes toward Israel, toward Zionism, and really that was in the decades since then, there was this almost wall-to-wall communal embrace of Zionism, and it becomes a fundamental part of American Jewish congregational life, not just for Orthodox, but across all the denominations. It becomes central in American Jewish education, in school, and in American Jewish culture. And I think most fundamentally, Zionism becomes a core element, a constitutive element of American Jewish identity, what it means to be Jew, what it means to be an American Jew. In many ways, it becomes the thing that defines an American Jew, because they disagree about religion. They disagree about Judaism. They don't share increasingly any common religious practices or religious beliefs. So in the absence of kind of shared religious beliefs and practices, Zionism, support for Israel, becomes the one thing American Jews had in common across denominations. And rejecting Zionism becomes tantamount to heresy. In fact, it's less acceptable to reject Zionism than to reject Judaism. Zionism becomes the cornerstone of American Jewish identity, and Jews who rejected it are kind of seen as traitors, self-hating Jews outside the Jewish community. So why did Zionism become so popular? I mean, it may seem obvious, but it's worth considering the reasons why, because it also helps us to understand, I think, the challenges it's facing today. Well, I think, first of all, it was seen and still is seen by many as a kind of insurance policy, essentially, particularly in the aftermath of the Holocaust. Israel is perceived as a place of refuge, as a safe haven for Jews in a hostile world, and especially for endangered Jewish communities. And to the extent to which there were many, and now at this moment in time, there still is another endangered Jewish community, of course, in the Ukraine. Zionism is seen as a place of refuge, but more than that, it is also seen, the state of Israel is seen as a defender of Jews around the world, as a kind of guardian of Jewish security. And this becomes particularly important as the Holocaust becomes increasingly central in American Jewish consciousness, which doesn't happen overnight. It's a kind of gradual process of the Holocaust becoming very important in American Jewish consciousness, and that increases support for Israel. I think another factor is the way in which, particularly for secular American Jews who were assimilating into the American mainstream, Zionism, as I kind of alluded to earlier, functions as a kind of substitute religion. Essentially, for them, it's a way of being Jewish without having to practice Judaism, know anything about Judaism. So it's a way of being and doing Jewish, not just maintaining a sense of Jewish identity, but also expressing that. And you can express that through support for Israel, through advocacy for Israel or philanthropy for Israel. So it's a way of being Jewish without having to be religious. It also became not just a source of identity and security, but also a source of pride. a kind of vicarious sense of pride in that American Jews and Jews around the world, in identifying with Israel, could also take pride in its accomplishments and its victories. They could have a vicarious sense of pride through that. And that was also, I think, very important, particularly in the 1960s and 70s, as a kind of identity politics was blossoming, let's say, across the United States. Different communities are kind of emphasizing their own distinctness and looking for sources of pride. And then finally, Zionism was seen as perfectly compatible, aligned with the democratic and liberal values of American Jewry at large, right? So Israel was seen as an outpost of democracy in a sea of authoritarianism, surrounded by hostile authoritarian regimes, reactionary regimes in many cases. And Zionism then is perceived as a progressive movement, as a progressive force. Supporting Israel meant supporting democracy. So there's no conflict, there's no tension between American Jews' liberalism or their progressive values and their support for Israel. At the same time, I think for all of these reasons, it's also important to recognize that the Israel that American Jews fell in love with in the 60s and 70s was in many ways an imaginary one. They actually hadn't been to Israel. Very few ever went there. It took a long time. It was uncommon to visit Israel. Even today, most American Jews have never been to Israel. But in recent years, growing numbers have. But they hadn't gone to Israel. They really didn't follow what was happening there. It was very difficult. If you wanted to follow what was happening in Israel, maybe you would subscribe to Israeli newspaper, which would take weeks to arrive, right? Unlike today, where we can immediately download all the Israeli news and the whole spectrum of Israeli media. Back then, that was just not possible. So it's actually very hard to actually follow to even know what was happening in Israel, to have any sense or understanding of the country. And of course, very few American Jews spoke Hebrew, learned Hebrew, so that also prevented them from really having any access to understanding the country and the culture. So in many ways, Israel functioned as a kind of screen on which American Jews could project both their fantasies and their fears. It was a kind of mythic land. And of course, the Israel that many American Jews imagined was the Israel immortalized or mythologized in Exodus, right? That was Paul Newman, who was the star, of course, of the movie of Exodus, was the archetypal Sabra in the eyes of many American Jews, and not just American Jews. What I'm describing is true for Jews in many other diaspora countries, including in the United Kingdom, where I grew up. And Israel wasn't just a screen, it was a very important symbol. So in many ways, in supporting Israel, they were supporting a symbol of Jewish recovery after the Holocaust, a symbol of Jewish power. Again, particularly after the Holocaust, which was where Jewish powerlessness was seen. And it was a symbol of Jewish unity. It was the thing that brought Jews together. And in many ways, it became the glue that held the American Jewish community together. Turning to Americans in general, as I said, it wasn't just within the American Jewish community that Zionism triumphed. It also triumphed among Americans at large. And again, this triumph really took place after the Six-Day War. Before then, Israel was not widely supported among Americans. There wasn't much interest in Israel, and Israel was not supported by the United States government very much. France, many people imagine that the US has always been Israel's closest ally, but in fact, before 1967, France was Israel's closest ally. It was the French who helped Israel build the nuclear power reactor in Dimona, for example. Nuclear power reactor. So it was only after 1967 that you see this kind of real shift in terms of support for Israel. And again, I think there are many reasons for this. Probably first and foremost was the perception among Americans in general now, shared by American Jews, of Israel as the underdog. Essentially, there's a kind of tendency among people to automatically support the underdog, the perceived underdog in any conflict, right? If you don't have otherwise a stake, you're going to support who you think is the weaker side, and Israel was perceived as the kind of David against the Arab Goliath, surrounded by enemies bent on its destruction. So that was part of the American embrace and support for Israel. Israel was also perceived as the only democracy in the Middle East, and a country that shared and it was a country that shared American values in a way that was the only place in the region that did so. And I think also as Holocaust education becomes more widespread in the United States, and again, this didn't happen overnight. This is as a result of educational practice and particularly television programs that begin to expose Americans to what had happened in the Holocaust. So there's this tendency, I think, to see Israel both as a place of refuge, but more than that, to believe basically the Jews deserved their own state after the suffering in the Holocaust, really a kind of compensation almost for Jewish suffering. Some would say, and a way to assuage Gentile guilt. I don't think that's true, because I don't think most Americans actually know how little the United States did in the Holocaust, during the Holocaust, so I don't think they necessarily do feel guilty. But I do think there was a sense, at least, of kind of, a compensation that Jews deserve this, and also Israel as a safeguard against the second Holocaust, which is also, of course, important for Americans. And then finally, and this could be the subject of a lecture to itself, there's the embrace of Israel and of Zionism within the evangelical Protestant community, which again didn't happen overnight, and it really happens really after 1967. And it's promoted by very popular evangelists like Reverend Billy Graham, important visit to Israel, 1960, and begins to kind of promote Christian Zionism within the evangelical community. And then later, the Reverend Jerry Falwell, also very important in promoting Christian Zionism. And then the final force worth mentioning is the rise of Holy Land tourism, Christian pilgrimages. And this was actually something that the Israeli Ministry of Tourism was very involved in encouraging evangelical Christians to go to Israel and to visit. And this really strengthens the evangelical Christian support for Israel, which I will just say is about a lot more than just, this kind of hopes for the second coming of Jesus. That's often the way it's understood, but there are actually many more motivations for Christian Zionism than just kind of eschatological ones. So as Zionism becomes increasingly popular, both among American Jews in particular and Americans in general, so support for Israel becomes really a bedrock principle of American politics. Both Jews and Christians, Democrats and Republicans support Israel, and there's really a kind of wall-to-wall consensus that exists for decades. This is the consensus, as I've described it, this pro-Israel, not just a pro-Israel, but a Zionist consensus, as in consensus that there is a need for and a justification for a Jewish state in the land of Israel. That's how it's really understood. This consensus, I think, is starting to unravel today. Unravel both within the American Jewish community and outside of the American Jewish community. So in terms of the American Jewish community, I'll start there. There is, I think, a shift taking place. This is a shift that's taking place over a long period of time. This hasn't happened overnight. I think in many ways one can trace this back to the 1980s, as early as the as a kind of ethnic chauvinism, right? And that, I think, has also, again, led many to be uncomfortable with identifying as a Zionist. And then a final factor, I think, for Jews is the way in which it's become controversial, even unacceptable in certain settings to identify as a Zionist. And we all hear that's happening on college campuses. I think, that's not by any means happening on every college campus. It's happening in progressive spaces, whether it's on campus or in other places. And it's certainly true that in these progressive spaces, Zionism is becoming associated or even equated with colonialism, racism, and even more recently, white supremacism. Like it's as if this is the obvious meaning of what Zionism means. But it's not just among Jews, I think, that this shift is taking place. It's also happening among Americans in general, and particularly, again, among the more secular Americans, so among more religious Americans, this isn't happening. It's really the more secular Americans, the more liberal Americans, and the more highly educated Americans, those with college degrees or postgraduate degrees. And this is all borne out in the survey data, which shows that there's a clear correlation between kind of criticism of Israel, sympathy for the Palestinians, and secular and religiosity on the one hand, political orientation, whether you're conservative or liberal, levels of education, and age. And we hear a lot about generational differences, and that's certainly true. So there is a clear generational gap with younger Americans, much more critical of Israel and much more supportive of the Palestinians than older Americans. And I think a large part of that has to do simply with the periods of time in which people have come of age and the events that are happening when people come of age. Those events shape people's worldviews. And it's hard sometimes. I sometimes don't forget. I mean, just to take I was teaching the other day, and many of my students in the class were obviously upset about what was happening in Ukraine. And I didn't even realize at first, it didn't strike me at first that for them, this was actually the very first war that they've really witnessed. And it's just striking how things that you kind of, I was thinking of, well, surely you remember the war in Iraq, but no, that was when they were young children, and 9/11 was when it happened in many cases before they were born. So the Oslo peace process is not even something that's ancient history. They don't know who Yitzhak Rabin is. The only thing they have come of age is during the Second Intifada, Israel's wars with Hamas or Hezbollah. They have no memory, they have no experience of an earlier Israel. And I think each generation, speaking myself, my father was living in a kibbutz in Israel in the 1960s, as some others of his generation did. I came of age during the first Intifada. So each generation comes of age during these very different periods, and they shape, I think, perceptions of Israel. There's not only a generational divide, though, which is growing in the United States today, but there's also a partisan divide. And we hear a lot about this. It's I think, somewhat overstated, because most Americans, both liberal and conservative Democrats and Republicans, still support Israel. Majorities show that they still support Israel. But there is a gap, and there's a widening gap in terms of attitudes toward Israel. Just give you one recent opinion poll that was conducted by the Pew Research Center, which is a very reliable polling institution, found that 55% of Democrats viewed Israel favorably. So not, widespread antipathy, as sometimes you might get the impression of, but that compared with 74% of Republicans. So there is a growing partisan gap. And surveys also show that Democrats are much more likely to sympathize with the Palestinians now, and increasingly viewing the conflict through one lens as a human rights, or even most recently in terms of racial justice. So the lens through which the conflict is being viewed has completely changed. So that Israel is no longer seen as the David against the Arab Goliath, but now Israel is the Goliath against the Palestinian David. Israel has lost its aura of innocence in the eyes of Americans. It's no longer seen as embattled or heroic, but isn't seen as a dominant military power in the region, as an occupier, and even in the minds of many as a oppressor. And I think this shift is really being accelerated just in the last few years by what is kind of the mainstreaming of a Palestinian narrative. In other words, Palestinian perspectives, narratives, voices, which were almost unheard of in years past. There was a study done of looking at the opinion, the op-ed page of the New York Times, and between 1970 and 2000, not a single Palestinian voice was featured there, but that's shifted just in the last few years. And now we hear that much more commonly. And there are many reasons for why that's occurring. But I think as this narrative, and it's a narrative, their narrative has become increasingly more widely heard. And as kind of pro-Palestinian campaigning has become much more prominent, so there's growing support for Palestinian rights. And alongside that, increasing criticism, not just of Israeli policies, but of Israel itself, of Zionism itself, and anti-Zionism, which was a marginal phenomenon. I mean, really on the political margins. No, can't think of anyone in Congress who would identify as an anti-Zion. They may be critical of specific Israeli policies, but anti-Zionism wasn't something that could get you elected. It was something that was basically politically taboo. That is now moving from the margins to the mainstream. And as a result of that, the question of how Jews should respond to this development has become increasingly urgent and an important one. So I've described the shift that's taking place. And I've identified what I think are some of the reasons for why this is taking place, which I think hopefully makes the point that this isn't a transitory phenomenon. This isn't something that's just happened just come about over the last couple of years. It's accelerating, but it's, I think, a shift that is a historical shift that is taking place, both inside and outside the American Jewish community, and one that poses, therefore, profound challenges for Jewish Zionists in the United States and elsewhere, in other diaspora communities as well, where similar processes, and each one is different. I'm just going to focus, I'm just talking here in the American context, but it is, I think, profoundly challenging, both to come across to the questioning, the challenging, the critiquing of Zionism within the Jewish community and beyond the Jewish community. And so the question of how to respond, and as I promised Rav Konetsky, I try and have some very modest suggestions. I think the response has to be, and this is in the title of my talk, a nuanced Zionism, which is to say, not a dogmatic one, right? One that, on the one hand, can recognize that actually Zionism can mean different things for different people. For Jews within the Jewish community, I think it's important to, first of all, accept that people are wrestling with this, that these questions, that this wrestling, that the questions of the necessity for a Jewish state or the justifications for Zionism isn't something we should be fearful of, isn't something we should try to prevent or shut down, but rather is something that we can allow for and allow people to develop their own relationship with Zionism, which changes over time. So I think sometimes when it comes to young people, in particular, there may be a period of time where they might reject some of these things, particularly because they're rejecting a certain mythic, idealized view. But that doesn't mean that's the end of their relationship with Israel. I think we have to allow them to continue to have. I think what's important to insist upon is that they engage with the reality of Israel, right? That they can't deny the reality of Israel or the importance of Israel in terms of Jewish life globally, but how they relate to Israel and what their relationship is to Israel at any specific point in time, I think need to be tolerant of, and accepting that there are many different ways to be a Zionist, as there were originally. And so, as long as for me, what I struggle with is apathy or indifference. If I'm actually much more welcoming if and encouraged if somebody's actually wrestling, if somebody's actually even disagreeing, critical, but that, because then they have a relationship. Then they have a relationship, and that relationship, as I said, can evolve. It does evolve over time and in people's lives. So that's on the one hand of allowing for and acknowledging multiple Zionisms and an evolving relationship with Zionism. At the same time, there is also going to be the question of how Jewish Zionists should relate to those who are not Zionist, or non-Zionist or anti-Zionist. And I think that it is important, because this is going to be a growing phenomenon, to find a way to accommodate this ideological pluralism within the Jewish community. Because the alternative is to try to will result in splits and schisms and internecide warfare, essentially, right? To try to impose or insist upon a unanimity of opinion is not only, I think, unlikely to succeed, it's ultimately counterproductive because it's going to drive people away. So I think rather than imposing kind of, litmus tests on who should be or allowed to be included in the Jewish community, and including a Jewish community on campus or any Jewish community, we need to really have an open tent, not just a big tent, but an open tent. As long as there's a commitment to the Jewish people, to Jewish peoplehood and the welfare of Jews in Israel, which I include in that. So I think that's the challenges within the Jewish community itself. And one other challenge is trying to find, given this new ideological pluralism, this new political diversity of opinion that is emerging, what is it that can hold Jews together? In the absence, if Zionism is no longer the ideological glue that holds the Jewish community in this country together, what can? Or are we just going to kind of fracture into 100 different communities? Anti-Semitism is also not something that should very negative. I mean, obviously, it is something that holds people together, but I think there needs to be there needs to be a positive basis for Jewish identification and community, and not just a kind of reactive, negative one. In terms of the wider society, I would say the great challenge there is going to be, and will continue to be, even more so in the years to come, coming to terms with the Palestinian narrative, hearing the Palestinian narrative, which is not to say agreeing with the Palestinian narrative or accepting everything about it as, absolutely the truth, but not recoiling upon hearing this, not trying to silence it or deny it or dismiss it as anti-Semitic. The fact is that this is the Palestinian narrative. Their experience of Zionism is understandably very different than the Jewish experience of Zionism. Zionism for Jews has meant liberation, I think, for many Jews at least, for most, and it has meant oppression for many Palestinians. And we need to accept that. That doesn't mean rejecting Zionism. It means seeing that these things can both be true at the same time. It can be both an emancipatory project, a liberation project, and at the same time one that has had terrible consequences for the Palestinians. And that's not about apportioning historical blame. It's simply recognizing the consequences of Zionism in practice for Palestinians. So I think saving Zionism in that respect demands an honest reckoning with the realities, both for Jews and for non-Jews. And I think it is important to be able to acknowledge what the Palestinian experience and how they perceive Zionism and their response and the issues that they have, without saying that that is without rejecting Zionism together, right? Being able to kind of have that ability to what I call resilient listening, where you can listen. You don't have to agree with everything you hear, but you can hear it, you can listen to it, you can try to understand where they're coming from. The need to do that, I think, is imperative. I think we have to be able to raise particularly young Jews and college students who have that ability, who can actually have that resilient listening and be able to hear that, because otherwise trying to protect Jewish students from that narrative, from hearing that, to try to keep it away from them is neither, I think, feasible, because they will be exposed to it. There's no way they're not going to be exposed to it. So there's just no way you can kind of shut it out or shut it down. But it's also, I think, not morally acceptable either. I think it's important for both political, moral, and communal reasons to be able to find that space. And so in that way, I think modeling what it looks like to wrestle with these questions in a genuinely honest way, to acknowledge that one doesn't have all the answers, to acknowledge that, there is sometimes real tragedies. In other words, there can be two rights. And it's not necessarily a question of this one side's wrong, the other side's right. There can be two rights. There can be two narratives. And having Zionists recognize that ability to hold two narratives in their heads, two rights, and live with that, however uncomfortable and awkward it is, I think is the ultimately not necessarily a solution, but I think it's the way in which we can be a kind of resilient form, a nuanced form of Zionism in the 21st century. Otherwise, I think the alternative is a very brittle one that cannot withstand these kinds of challenges, that cannot withstand exposure to a Palestinian narrative, and one that is intolerant. And I think we have to be able to have confidence in being able to say, actually, we can listen to these things, we can hear these things. It doesn't mean to say we throw everything out, we discard our Jewish identity. It's not an either or proposition. I'll end with that. Thank you.
Mood our friends on Zoom as well. If you were zooming in, we would say good night, and we would talk among ourselves. But I invite you to be among ourselves, like because you are of all, of all the speakers we have had. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, you are the first Jewish speaker, though. So please join us among ourselves.
Well, if there are questions or comments from that you'd like me, that I didn't cover in my talk, I'm happy to engage on that as well in general. Yeah. It's contested. Mm. Yeah. Yeah. That's yeah. You're you're right. I mean, so I wasn't focusing on how we should respond to what's happening in Israel and Israeli policies, and that is an absolutely hugely important issue. Um, I would just say on that, personally, I can just speak for myself. I do think it is important for Jews and for people in general to make the distinction between the government, between a government and a country and a society. I think, for many, particularly, I think particularly for Jews who haven't spent any time in Israel and don't really know it, there's just, Israel is what whoever is the prime minister, or, for many, it's just, it was and still is in the minds of some, Netanyahu. And it's just the government. And so I think just as Americans, many Americans are strongly critical of of many policies and practices and laws and inequalities in the United States, and yet love the United States and can make that distinction, because they know, because we live here, we know that it's not just what's happening in Washington, D.C. I think, unfortunately, there is a conflation in many people's minds between whatever the Israeli government has done or has done historically, and I'm not just talking about today, and Israel itself and Israeli society. So for me, I think, look, being a nuanced Zionist means recognizing there is a distinction, right? We can be strongly critical of Israeli government policies, both past and present, of the actions, because these actions or these decisions were mistaken. On the one hand, I think we have to, when making that criticism, and I'm somebody who's been critical, I also think we need to do so with a lot of empathy and compassion, and recognize that it's easy. And I'm not saying we don't have a right to criticize from abroad, but first of all, decisions I'm always trying to tell my students, well, what would you have done in that circumstance? Right? It's easy sometimes in hindsight to criticize, but we often don't really acknowledge the dilemmas, the really difficult decisions that policymakers face. And we also don't live in that emotional reality of fear, of conflict, of grief, of loss, of mourning that so many in Israel, both Jews and non-Jews, have experienced. So I think, yes, we absolutely should do that, and we should have a right to do that. We should speak out when necessary. But at the same time, we shouldn't just simply, see Israel solely through the lens of what Israeli governments have done or Israeli leaders do, nor should, and we should also try to have a degree of empathy and compassion, because we don't really know what it is like. At least many of us don't really know what it's like to have lived through many of the experiences that people in Israel have lived through, or we don't even know what governments have to face. So yeah, I agree with you. I think that is a big challenge. We all face that, and for me, the answer to that is not to be silent. I think it's important for not just Jews but non-Jews to see that there is a willingness that it's not just Israel right or wrong when it comes to Israeli government. But as I say, Israel is not the Israeli government. Israel is a broader place than that, and Israeli society and Israeli culture. And I think for many, actually going forward, where I think Israel and Zion is most enriching today isn't in terms of political support for Israeli government. It's not on the advocacy, on the politics. It's in Israeli culture. It's actually the ways in which Israeli television has become, TV programs have become very popular over here. It's the ways in which Jews can travel in Israel, go to Israel and have these experiences. So it's societal, not necessarily state. And I think, and I actually think in many ways, one can be critical of the state without necessarily rejecting that entire enterprise.
One from the West.
So I'm thinking about the organized trips to Israel for young people, mostly birthright, maybe other trips. And that they show their students Israel proper, how much engagement or positions is delivered during the Israel. And do you think that that should change so that the students are engaging in the way I think you suggested about these issues and struggling with that?
Yeah.
They would back on campus.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm I think I have mixed feelings. On the one hand, I think the birthright has had hugely positive impact in terms of solidifying identification, attachment to Israel among younger Jews. On the other hand, I am ambivalent about it because the billions of dollars that has gone in there I think some of that money could have gone toward subsidizing the cost of Jewish education here in the United States, for example. And so the priorities, I think the idea of shoring up American Jewish identity through free trips to Israel, as opposed to Jewish education, is just the priority is just a miss in terms of what we prioritize. And I think, unfortunately, as I say, is that it's become Israel tourism as a way to give American Jews a sense of Jewish identity, as opposed to trying to think about how can we actually really do that here in the United States. But in terms of the trip itself, yes, I absolutely think it should not be, Israel is a real country. It's not just like a Disneyland for teenagers to go but in many ways, what I've seen for the students who go on birthright is, in many cases, they're smart enough to know that they're getting a small slice of what they're seeing. And so I as an Israel studies professor, actually it's been really good because a lot of them might come back and then want to take a course. I'll go back again. So I think, as long as they understand it's just an appetizer and not the main course, so, right? And as long as they recognize that they are not they're seeing a very airbrushed view of Israeli reality. And, I went, well, in England, it used to be through Zionist youth groups. So I went when I was 16 on that, a version of that. And, it wasn't. And so in many ways, it's the beginning of engagement. I had been to Israel before, but for many, at least it gives them something and they can follow up. So in that sense, I do support it, but I do think this idea, and this is more broadly, I think it's very patronizing to young Jews to say they cannot be exposed to these difficult things. You have to protect them from that, because if they're exposed to that, they will want to run away from Israel or from Zionism. Well, A, we don't have that luxury because they're going to be exposed to it on social media, in various businesses. But B, actually exposing to that in a way where they can ask these questions. I've taken students on 5-week educational programs, and it is a really difficult experience for particularly for the Jewish students. But in many ways, as I say, it's actually in that wrestling that's an honest place to be, and they can handle that. So they can handle complexity. They can handle these things. We shouldn't try and wrap them in cotton wool. So long answer. I think it's good, but I would also like some of that money spent on right here in the United States, which I have a 4-year-old, and it's just crazy. It's really crazy how expensive Jewish life is. And we're subsidizing free trips to Israel instead of helping to subsidize Jewish life in the United States. And so I think that's, and I also, as a final thing, and this is maybe, I also would love it if we had these kinds of programs to other parts of the Jewish diaspora, because I also think it's not just Israel that young Jews need to learn about. They also don't know very much about any other Jewish community anywhere else, or they see basically it as dying communities, which is not really true. So I also think it would be great if we could have a reverse birthright of Israeli Jews coming here and them going to other places in the Jewish world and seeing that Judaism is not just dying around the world.
So first of all, thank you.
Thanks. Mm.
And we're trying to have this conversation. And, you know,
Yeah, I mean,
college. Or maybe not for their children in college. Are they going to with this? How hard is it to be on campus? Want to stand up, or want to run away?
yeah, so on the one, I'm going to give a kind of on the one hand, on the other hand. First of all, I do think, I mean, there are challenges, and I don't want to deny that in particularly in certain spaces on campus and on certain campuses, you know, in the elite universities on the coasts and in small liberal arts colleges, you know, which tend to be the most politically active and politically progressive, there is no doubt the challenge. But I do think that the perception that has taken hold among many American Jews that colleges everywhere have become hotbeds of anti-Semitism is wildly exaggerated. And it's very strange because, I mean, you know, universities have been a massive, amazing vehicle for Jewish upward mobility. Jewish studies is flourishing, Israel studies is flourishing, Jewish life is flourishing on college campuses. At the very same time as there's this perception that Jews are like hiding under their desks. So I think we need to have a sense of perspective and proportion, which is to say, there are some highly publicized cases, you know, incidents happening in the most elite universities, like the ones that are most, that's the one, you know, the Columbias, that's what the news media tends to report on, not the vast majority. You know, there's more than 200,000 Jewish colleges. I mean, there's a huge number, they're just going about their lives, taking like classes, applying for jobs. So I think we should get that in perspective. Where it is, but nevertheless, it is happening in some places. I look at, say, UCLA. We do events all the time. And I run the Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. I mean, admittedly, the last year and a half, we've been doing Zoom events, so we haven't had, thankfully, you know, any kind of Zoom bombing or anything like that. But even before that, you know, we hosted President Rivlin came to campus, and I was nervous. I was like, is there going to be, you know, noisy protests? Didn't happen. So I think it's sometimes these incidents happen. They're generally involve a small number of really noisy students, and they're basically the Students for Justice in Palestine chapters, clubs. That's really, it's not like all of the student body. Most of the student governments aren't, they're just these resolutions, BDS resolutions, often pass because students aren't paying attention. It's like the small number who are really politically active. So I understand the concern of like, I wouldn't want my son or my daughter, you know, being in this environment. But I think actually the environment is not as hostile as it's often made out to be. And I think we have to be wary about kind of accepting this narrative. I think we also have to make a distinction between anti-Semitism, which is never acceptable, and the expression of anti-Zionism, as in, it's one thing where Jewish students are being excluded from clubs or societies. That's anti-Semitic, right, because of their identities. Or where, you know, the Hillel becomes a target, or in some cases where kosher food is banned. So when those things happen, that we need to be unequivocal, and we need to call it. And in my experience, university administrations are very responsive to that. But when it's a professor or student group or a protest, not everything is necessarily anti. It may be anti-Israel, it certainly is anti-Israel, or even anti-Zionist, but it's not necessarily anti-Semitic. So we need to be able to kind of make these kinds of distinctions. And sending off, you know, children to college, we need to explain to them that it is a place where they will be challenged. They should be challenged. They should not seek out just safe spaces where they're going to be around people who agree with them. I remember when I went to college, I went to a modern Orthodox Jewish boarding school. And I had never, so I really was in a, you know, very kind of cloistered environment. And then I went to a yeshiva, and then I went to Oxford. And I was one of the few Jewish students and I was studying politics. So, you know, I got that all the time. And I definitely heard what I would call the kind of, you know, anti-Semitic, not out of animosity, just ignorance. And people saying things like, you're not really English, and things like that. And yes, it did affect me, but that's not a bad thing in a way. That means first of all, you respond and you can debate and argue, but also that's part of being at college in a way. And I'm not saying it's acceptable to be, you know, bullied or ostracized, and that does happen in some cases, more on social media, I think, than like actually in person. And social media is just a cesspool where that kind of thing happens. But I think in a way, rather than try to protect our students and, you know, have them just be in these kind of places where they don't have to explain Zionism or defend it or hear anything, or hear the voices of students who do think of Zionism as just like white supremacism, they need to be able to take that and not shy away from it. One of the things that most upsets me is Jewish students who don't want to take courses on Israel because they are worried what will be said. And, you know, and I'm like, no, you need to learn. You shouldn't be afraid of that, and you shouldn't avoid those difficult discussions. So yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, that is, so there is that phenomenon. I think it's, what's motivating that isn't anti-Semitism, but there's two things. There's BDS, but more than that is a very misleading, false idea of intersectionality, where it's not just like a progressive, a Zionist can't join, you know, a club about politics. It might be on the environment, it might be on completely because there is this idea that, you know, they understand on some of the progressive left on campus that, you know, all oppression is linked, and so I have to defend, you know, and Zionism is simply oppression. It is a problem. As I say, it's I think not as widespread a phenomenon as it's sometimes made out to be, but I mean, I think the answer to that is not to keep students away from these places, but ultimately, you know, Jewish students, unfortunately, it's not the first time they've been fighting these battles on campus. Zionism, there was the Zionism racism resolution in the 1970s. In the United Kingdom, that led to Jewish student unions being banned because they were. So, you know, I mean, it is a problem, and I don't wish to minimize it, but I think we need to kind of have a sense of perspective, and when that happens, just push back by pointing out, in many cases, why it is wrong. And often the students doing that are just ignorant, really. They're just don't know. They think this is what solidarity with the Palestinians means. It's actually, they have no idea. I'll try and answer more quickly next time. Sorry. I'll keep my answer short. Yes, and Middle East politics.
What and what kinds of books you have done?
Well, mine. Yes, thank you for that question. Yeah. So I teach a course on Middle East politics, a general course, not specifically about Israel, and then I teach a course specifically on Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so I wrote a book on that. So I use that as a Q&A. It's all in Q&A, question and answer format, so it's quite accessible. And then I assign another book, which was written by 3 authors at Brandeis University. One is a Jewish author, another is an Arab, and another is a Palestinian, multiple narratives. And so I use those 2 as the kind of core books and then supplement it with articles. And I find, one of the exercises, just to give you an example of one of the things I do, this coming week, we do a simulation toward the end of the semester. We're now entering week 9 at UCLA. And I do a simulation of peace talks of trying to have a negotiate 2-state solution. And I generally assign, if I figured out their politics or their viewpoints, I generally try and assign the students who are sympathetic with the Palestinians, they have to be the government of Israel. And the students who are sympathetic with Israel, they have to be the PLO. And so they spend like a week to 2 weeks preparing for this simulation, like a 3-hour peace talks. They have to negotiate all the final status issues, try and reach an agreement. So again, part of that exercise is just of trying to get them to be able to stand in someone else's shoes and see it from there and understand the arguments. So that's a lot of the assignments are kind of like that, trying to do that. But really, I'm not worried about the students who take my class because they're open-minded, they want to take the class. I have a lot of Arab students, a lot of Palestinian students, and they're really, and they often say, wow, we had no idea like these things. But it's the students who don't want to take the class because they're like, oh, we know everything. We don't need to learn. That's the problem.
That said, I also feel like my gut reaction is similar in that fixing what's actually is not me. Yeah, that's that, you can put on a nice suit, but not gonna
So you're right. Okay.
Okay, well, you're not gonna get stuck.
Sure. That's a big. Yeah. Wow, these are really, really good questions, and I wish I had more time to answer them. Yeah, these are. I'll have to come back another time. Yeah. So first of all, on the question of Israel, I absolutely agree with you. I was focusing, honestly, I think in many ways, the future of Zionism in the United States is going to be ultimately contingent on what happens in Israel, and what happens between Israel and the Palestinians. But we over here have minimal impact. I'm not saying none, but the reality is there's little that we can directly do to change that situation. I mean, I think we should try, and we should have a voice. So what I was focusing on more is what we can do here in the United States, what is within our powers, which is with the things I was suggesting. But I absolutely agree that ultimately the future of Zionism, both particularly among Jews, will ultimately depend upon the trajectory of Zionism in Israel, and in many ways the reality of the kind of a binational reality is and the increasing threat to a possibility of the disappearance maybe of a two-state solution is an existential threat to the future of Zionism here and around the world. But tragically, I don't see a whole lot that we here can do to affect that. But that's not saying we shouldn't do anything. I think in terms of what it means to be a Jew, we should, but not necessarily because we can I don't actually think Israeli policymakers, nor necessarily should they, really. It's Israelis who need to sort that out. So that's on that question on anti-Zionism and the JDA. This is a whole topic unto itself. Basically, I will just say, basically, I do think there is a distinction, that it is important to draw a distinction, at least theoretically, between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. The question, to my mind, is not to make anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism. I think that is as simplistic as Zionism equals racism. The question for me is, when does anti-Zionism become anti-Semitism, right? And under what circumstances? So for me, we need to pay more attention to, there are anti-Semitic ways of expressing anti-Zionism, and there are anti-Semitic outcomes for anti-Zionism when Jews can be excluded, for example. So it's not that the two are never connected. In practice, they may be. But I think it's important to recognize that there is a distinction, because otherwise we're basically saying every Palestinian is an anti-Semite, more or less, right? Because they're anti-Zionist for the most part. And we're calling many people anti-Semite. And I think, for one thing, that doesn't recognize that they may have many real understandable reasons for their anti-Zionism, but also I think it ends up doing damage to the very idea of anti-Semitism and politicizing it and undermining the power of the at a time where Jews face a serious threat of anti-Semitism. So I think the conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, while understandable because sometimes they are connected in practice, we need to be able to at least, theoretically, conceptually make this distinction between the two. And I also think, just as a final thing on that the way the IRA definition, which is often has become so politicized and divisive that we spend too much time arguing about definitions and not enough time actually trying to stop actual anti-Semites and anti-Semitism. And I think we need to put a lot more energy on educating people about what anti-Semitism is than we are on trying to get institutions to adopt a single definition, which doesn't even stop anti-Semitism. Universities have adopted it and there's still anti-Semitic incidents. So that's a short answer, but to a long question. What was the final? Yeah, I think the discomfort with the very idea of any kind of peoplehood or does partly account for why younger Jews in particular are uncomfortable or questioning Zionism, because the whole idea of kind of, and one reason for this, of course, relates to intermarriage, because there is, I think, a big difference between Jews who are the offspring of intermarried couples in terms of how they understand Jewishness versus how Jews who aren't tend to have a more kind of ethnic notion of Jewish identity. And we see now the fact the majority of younger Jews who may be who have come from interfaith relationships, their notion of Jewish identity is much less ethnic and not built upon this notion of peoplehood. I do think personally, this is, where I think it is very important. I think it is fundamental to accept both Jewish peoplehood, this connection, and the responsibilities that come with that, right? So that means for me, I don't need every Jew to be a Zionist, right? I mean, I have that relationship, and I have a relationship, but for me, that's listen. I do where I'm less tolerant, if you will, is people say I just couldn't care less about Jews in Israel. No, you have the commitment is to the Jewish people and the connection we have to Jews around the world. That for me is like a trans-historical, that's predates Judaism. And that I think is really important, and that we need to kind of strengthen that sense and not see identity as something to be ashamed of or uncomfortable with. But as I said, the problem is that for many young Jews, Jewish identity has just become synonymous with support for Israel and Zionism. And so if we can slightly create that space, they could say they can identify as Jews instead of just thinking of Jewish identity as involving going on birthright tours and an uncritical support for Zionism. So you can be Jewish and you should take pride in that. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to have a particular position with regards to Israel. Okay, so the most recent one I was mentioning was the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what everyone needs to know. The title's not mine, it's a series by Oxford University Press, what everyone needs to know. And before that, my book was called Trouble in the Tribe, the American Jewish Conflict over Israel. And I am working on a new book, working is a very, not sure if I'm thinking about a new book, which will eventually come out, which will be tackling this whole question of the connections between Israel and anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, because when I wrote Trouble in the Tribe about about the politics of Israel and the American Jewish community, it was, even though the book only came out 5 or 6 years ago, it was a different time. Anti-Semitism was not the dominant concern that it is today. And so I think now, much as we are understandably concerned and focused on Israel, we really need to be thinking seriously about anti-Semitism and the particular threat that Jews face from the far right and from some of these groups and in other places today. I'm sorry to end on a very bleak note, but that's kind of part of my course for my topics. Thank you.